Just to set the tone a little bit for those who haven't read the book, you have essentially an established government that is devolving into chaos, multiple militias. You have Sunni, you have Shia, you have Druze, Maronite, you have different factions across the city. You have Israel coming in and out, incursions. So essentially they're put into the most tactically disadvantageous position possible. They're put in as peacekeepers. And these guys are put into this position, essentially the middle of a civil war, and told to keep the peace.
It is my great pleasure to introduce our honored panelists. Jack Carr serves his country. Previously as a Navy special operator, a SEAL sniper, and now as an author, telling stories with heart-pounding action, inspiring heroes, wretched villains, Ben is one of them, and a love of country and freedom that nearly sets the pages on fire. After dedicating 20 years to the teams, Jack transitioned to the world of publishing, achieving his literary dream with the release of his debut novel, The Terminal List. His writing prowess has captivated readers globally through the tales of James Reese, and I saw many James Reese fans in the audience out there, and his New York Times best-selling novels, True Believer, Savage Son, Devil's Hand, In the Blood, Only the Dead, and Red Sky Morning. The Terminal List has been transformed into an exhilarating and often shocking #1 Amazon Prime Video series featuring Chris Pratt in the lead role. I was not available. A second season has been confirmed based on Jack's second novel, True Believer, with the release date to be announced. And so now our nation benefits again as Jack has turned his attention to nonfiction, where he can tell true stories of American heroes. Targeted Beirut, the 1983 Marine Barracks Bombing, and the Untold Origin Story of the War on Terror is Jack's first nonfiction work, but definitely not his last. James Scott, all the way to my right, is a distinguished author and scholar, has an impressive background that includes being a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. He is renowned for his works of history such as Black Snow, Rampage, The War Below, and The Attack on the Liberty. His exceptional writing and research have earned him recognition, notably as a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his epic book, Target Tokyo, about the famed Doolittle raid in early 1942. James holds an undergraduate degree from Wofford College, that's the last I'll say of that, and a master's degree in military history from the Citadel. Some of his faculty are in the audience today. I know they're deeply proud. Beyond his literary accomplishments, he is a highly regarded public speaker, often sought after to lead battlefield tours and deliver lectures at prestigious institutions globally. James resides right across the harbor in Mount Pleasant with his wife and 2 children, and he holds the position of scholar in residence at the Citadel, where his expertise and passion for history continues to inspire and educate others. Don Howell, immediately to my right, is a hospital corpsman, 3rd class, United States Marine Corps, when he deployed to Lebanon in 1983. Don was born on Christmas Day, 1961 in Honolulu, to Willard D. Howell, also a corpsman, and Mary J. Howell, 2 siblings, and attended Gordon Garrett High School in Charleston, South Carolina. Don devoted many years to military service and served at various locations, including Charleston Naval Hospital with the 1st Battalion 6th Marines, 1st Battalion 8th at Camp Lejeune, 3rd Medical Battalion at Okinawa, Japan, on the USS Samuel Gompers in Alameda, California, and the 5th Fleet in Bahrain. Don earned an associate degree in nursing from Trident Tech and a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from the Chamberlain School of Nursing as well. He completed programs in biological warfare identification at U.S. AMRID, Fort Detrick, Maryland, and preventative medicine at Naval Hospital in Oakland, California. He's the proud father of 2, Terrell and Rumi, who is here tonight. His sister Sheila has joined us as well. Following his dedicated service, he is retired as a critical care nurse and now resides in Somerville. Dr. James Ware, in the middle, is a native of Savannah, Georgia, graduated from Emory University with a Bachelor of Science degree in biology in 1978, received his Doctor of Dental Medicine degree from the Medical College of Georgia in 1982. Following his graduation, he joined the U.S. Navy, and was assigned to Fleet Marine Force, 2nd Dental Battalion at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Dr. Ware was assigned to the 24th Marine Amphibious Unit, which deployed to Lebanon, of course, as part of the multinational peacekeeping force. For his exceptional leadership and emergency medical services during this time, which you can read about in the book, if you haven't already, Dr. Ware was awarded the Bronze Star. His military career also included assignments in Okinawa, Japan, and with the British Royal Navy, where he served as the assistant dental surgeon at HMS Nelson, Portsmouth. After leaving active duty, Dr. Ware continued his service in the Naval Reserve and pursued a successful career in dentistry. Became a diplomat with the Federal Services of General Dentistry, a fellow of the International College of Dentists, and a master of the Academy of General Dentistry. Dr. Ware received awards and recommendations for his exemplary service, including the Legion of Merit, the Navy Meritorious Service Medal, and the Navy Commendation Medal with 3 gold stars. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Singleton, Marine Corps Reserve, enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve in 1977, eventually rising to the rank of sergeant. He became a field artillery officer after completing the officer basic course at Fort Sill. In 1983, Mark served as first lieutenant in Beirut as part of the peacekeeping force there. While there, he served as weapons platoon commander for Company A, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. After Beirut, Singleton served as junior aide-de-camp and protocol officer for the commanding general, 2nd Marine Division, and a tactics instructor at the USMC detachment at the U.S. Army Field Artillery School, teaching the soldiers about some direct fire, I suppose. During Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Captain Singleton organized and led a highly successful joint air and artillery raid against an Iraqi armored battalion. His final assignment before retirement was as the senior Marine Corps representative for Special Ops Command at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he served as a Marine Corps advisor to the commanding general of U.S. Special Ops. Beyond his military service, Singleton earned multiple master's degrees from prestigious institutions such as the U.S. Navy War College, the U.S. Army War College, Liberty University, and God Bless America, the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists.
So I think I'm going to kick this off just by talking about, for a second, before I get out of the way of their stories, which is the whole point of the book, why Beirut 1983. And if anyone's read my other thrillers, then you know that I weave a lot of history into those books. I talk about history a lot. In my social channels, I try to take every opportunity I can to draw a lesson or highlight an event from history in the hopes that it won't be forgotten, and we'll apply those lessons to a present problem set. So when I thought I had built up enough political capital with Simon & Schuster after a few books, I went to them to discuss starting a nonfiction series. And as part of that, I wrote down probably about 3 pages worth of terrorist events from the end of World War II up to 3 years ago when I talked to Simon & Schuster about doing this. And unfortunately, there was a lot to choose from. But I kept coming back to Beirut 1983 because it was such a pivotal point in our relationship with the Middle East. Really, the rules that we have been playing this game by between us, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, really those rules were set back in October of 1983. And Iran set those rules. But it's been this paradigm, this model that we've all been a part of ever since. There were terrorist events certainly before October of 1983. We had the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979. But things were more murky then. But certainly by October of 1983, these rules and this paradigm was set. I remember as a kid, the Newsweek, and a lot of you might remember the Newsweek and Time magazine covers. I was young, but I remember those on the dining room table. I was on my path. I already knew I was going to join the military and had my sights set on the SEAL teams. And anything that would come across our dining room table from Time or Newsweek or one of the newspapers that had anything to do with the military, I was all in on it. And that was a very formative event from the outside looking in for a young kid on a path into the military. So I wanted to capture the strategic, the operational, and the tactical level lessons of what happened there in Beirut. And I also wanted to humanize the story, because you hear 241 servicemen killed, that's a big number. But until you humanize it, you don't really understand that those decisions made at the executive level and then filter all the way down to that tactical level have multi-generational impacts. And so when you're making those decisions up here as a president, an advisor, senior level military leader, That's what you owe that person at that tactical level, what you owe that person's family, what you owe that team, what you owe the people you're committing downrange, is to understand the nature of the conflict in which you're engaged or about to commit U.S. forces. So I really wanted to humanize these events so they understand that a decision made up here in the Oval Office, the final decision maker in that entire chain is an 18, 19, 20-year-old kid with a rifle, off stake, finger on the trigger, watching a truck approach at some outpost somewhere in the world, wondering if it is laden with explosives or it just has bad suspension. And that young kid, 18, 19, 20, 21, that's the final decision maker in a chain that starts with the President of the United States. So wanted to capture those lessons and humanize it. And now I'm going to get out of the way, like James and I wanted to do with these stories, and hear about it from these guys in their own words. So, and I also want to thank them for not only sharing their stories with us and allowing us to tell these stories in the book, but for their time downrange, particularly in Beirut. So thank you guys so much. And another round of applause for these guys. And everybody from Beirut. All right. Yep. All right, so where should we start? Start with, want to start here to my right? Yeah. All right, let's start. You need to kick it off. You got to kick it off.
All right.
And your path to Beirut, when you think back about how you got to be there on October 23rd of 1983, what do you think back on? What's your path to Beirut?
All right, my path was, my first stop was at Camp Lejeune. I was working at the Navy Hospital, Charleston, and I got orders to go to Camp Lejeune. So I was really funny because, I was a Navy guy, and I was going the first time on the Marine Corps base. So we was having orientation. And the first thing I said to them as I was asking, all right, as I was saying, we went to Camp Lejeune for the first time, and we were doing orientation, and Marines and Army, they name their bases differently. So I was talking to the staff sergeant, and I said, so tell me about Fort Lejeune, and he just jumped all over. This is Camp Lejeune. So that was my initiation. I was thinking that these guys are a little too uptight. Anyway, the first stop for me was 1st Battalion, 6th Marines at Camp Lejeune. And I was a 3rd class, and we was at, we were in desert training in California. And there's a first class that he was a little different kind of guy, but he was second in charge. So anyway, we were using IV tubing at that time to put inside the airplanes to listen to the movies and so forth. So there's like one piece of tubing. I know this is kind of off, it'll come around. There was one piece of tubing that was left, and I kind of grabbed it because I wanted to listen to the movies and stuff on the way home. And the first class jumps across the cot and snatches it from my hands. And I was like, man, you're really childish. And I'm a 3rd class, he's an E6, I'm an E4. And I think that was the beginning of my transfer to 1-8. Shortly after we got back, they came and said, Pastor Howell, you'll be going to 1-8. I'm like, why? And that's how I got to Camp Lejeune in 1-8. Needless to say, I met the guys there. We did a lot of field ops together, well before we ever got to Beirut. So I got to know a lot of the guys. And me being in the medical department, I got to hear the cries and screams, particularly after we gave them shots. And those guys just couldn't handle shots. But that was my initiation. That's what brought me to 1-8. It was different, my first experience with Marine Corps base. But I snapped in, and I ended up staying with Marines for about 13 years.
All right. Jimmy, how about you? What was your path into to Beirut?
I arrived at Camp Lejeune in August of 1982. I was transferred in February of 1983, which was 3 months before we deployed to 1-8 Camp Geiger as their dental officer. Now, when you go to a unit in the United States Marine Corps and people are getting ready to deploy, there's two things happening. One is a whole lot of new people are coming in, and they're excited, and a whole lot of people are transferring out of that unit, and they're excited too because they had other things they wanted to do besides go on a med float. So as a dental officer, I needed to have all the records for every individual who was going on that float who was part of 1-8. 1-8 is about It's about a 900-man battalion. So my responsibility was for that battalion to oversee, make sure they had all their root canals done, their wisdom teeth out, fillings done, cleanings done. So I was a very integral part of the group as a naval officer, and I touched, talked to, and got to know every one of the people that were going on that float. I knew all the men who died, who were in that building. So my job was to ensure that their records were up to date and that they had the proper x-rays, because in 1983 we did not have DNA testing, and I knew that. And I knew that if a member of the team died, especially in a helicopter crash, that the identification process would need to be done very quickly and properly with the right information, which were dental x-rays. Back in that time, that's how we did it. So I was over the top OCD type of young dental officer, wanted to make sure I had everything squared away in that regard. By the time we got to Beirut, I had lists of individuals who were with us, and I kept that list as absolute pristine as I could to make sure each one of them had that check in the box. They had their bite wings, they had the dental x-rays they needed. And from the day that I checked the board in February of 1982 until the day I checked out, which was about February of 1984, about a year later, that was part of my role, and that's how I kind of got involved with the men of 1-8, the men who died and the men who survived.
Yeah. Mark, how about you? What's your path?
Well, I got to Lejeune in 1982 in the summer, and I got a phone call. Sheila and I were on leave, or I was on leave. We were in South Carolina, in Myrtle Beach, Conway is where I'm from. And some guy says, Singleton, what are you doing right now? I'm like, well, I was out here at my father-in-law's house. He said, you got to be at Camp Lejeune in the morning at 0800. And I said, what's going on? And Beirut was just getting ready to wrap up during this time. So I said, am I going somewhere? He said, shut your pie hole and get up here at 0800 in the morning. So I told Sheila, I said, I'm going to check in. Well, I checked in on Wednesday, and they told me I was going to Norway on Friday. And Sheila came up, and what's so comical about this, and I'm going into the Beirut story, was the last night we spent together before I went to Norway, we were in the Camp Lejeune hostess house, eating a Domino's pizza, watching Raymond Burr in Gorilla at Large in 3D glasses. So they sent me, I was a forward observer for a tank battalion during Operation Northern Wedding Beauregard. Came back from Norway, and then they said, Mark, you're going to 1-8. And I was all fired up. I was going to be a forward observer for Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. And I stayed with those guys all the way through the deployment until after I'd been wounded. And then when I came back later on, they moved me back to the artillery battery. What happened in 1-8 is they had an officer, Ron Baskowski, who retired as a brigadier general, who was fluent in French, a Naval Academy graduate. And so he was sent over to the French contingent, which at the time was the Foreign Legion. And so I took over a weapons platoon, which was an honor for me because I was an artillery officer commanding an infantry weapons platoon. I had the 60 millimeter mortars, machine guns, and so I had that platoon all the way up until the time I was wounded, and ended up getting an infantry secondary MOS out of it, and I loved it. And on the day of the bombing, when the bombing took place, I don't know if we're going that far yet, but one additional duty I had, I was the battalion landing team reaction force platoon commander. So I had about 50 Marines and about 3 amphibious tractors, and anytime one of the companies were hit or one of the battalion got hit somewhere, my job was to rush out and basically bolster whatever force was there. And on that particular day, that was my unfortunate duty, to be there on that particular day when the bomb went off.
Just to set the tone a little bit for those who haven't read the book or aren't as familiar with what was happening in Beirut at the time, you have essentially an established government that is devolving into chaos, multiple militias. You have Sunni, you have Shia, you have Druze, Maronite, you have different factions across the city. You have Israel coming in and out in different incursions. So essentially they're put into the most tactically disadvantageous position possible, an untenable position. They're put in as peacekeepers, and Marines essentially are trained up to go in, crush an enemy, and come home. and these guys are put into this position, it's essentially the middle of a civil war, and told to keep the peace. Does that?
Yeah, that's spot on.
Okay.
And if you look at the image up above, this is the U.S. Embassy, which was hit in April 1983 by Hezbollah. It was sort of their trial run that they would then execute 188 days later on the battalion landing team headquarters in barracks. And
Yeah.
So this is the world you guys came into. You guys actually arrived the month after this bombing takes place. So tell us, what was Beirut like in the summer of 1983?
First, I want to say hi to my sister.
Hey.
I'm from Charleston, so you have to bear with me.
Yeah.
But anyway, just really quickly about this building here. During the time of when the embassy was blown up, we was home on leave for 30 days. And I was sitting at home, like a young 19-year-old, I'm sleeping late. My mother comes rushing into the room and wakes me up, tells me to turn on the television. Now, of course, at this point, she knows that I'm going to Beirut and why I was home for 30 days. And so I turn on the TV and I see the American embassy get blown up. And I told my mother, Mom, don't worry about it. They're going to have, we're going to have good security. There's not going to be a problem. And, we're going to be safe. So, but my mother just wasn't feeling it. But once we got to Beirut, the first thing, because, it takes about 2-3 weeks to float over. So the first thing that I saw, because I walked out on the gangway, which is basically, just walking out to the outside, and I looked at Beirut for the very first time. And I saw this haze over the city. And you heard it at a distance, this boom, 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 boom. And it was perpetual. It just kept going on and on and on. And I knew, and you can see at a distance just how war-torn the country was, the city was. And I just got this feeling of, the first thing that came out of my mouth was, I'm not dying here. Just give me a moment. So, but anyway, I was able to see just the gravity of what we were about to face. So, a lot of other guys started coming out and they took a look at the building, took a look at the scene, I should say. And, everyone had comments and so forth, but we were always trying to cheer each other up. But I do have to mention this one gentleman named Marion Keys. He was also a corpsman with us. First class. And he came out as well. And he looked at the place and immediately he just turned white. And the entire time we were there, this guy was just like paranoid. I mean, to the point that you couldn't sit next to the guy. He was just so annoying, he was so paranoid.
He's a big guy, too.
He's a big guy. Big guy. So, God bless him. And, but looking back, because we used to tease him and stuff like that. I said, man, Keys, just shut up, man. He was like, man, we're not going to make it, man. He's always just, but, it's funny just how people know. And he is.
If I may, it progressed over time, though. When we first arrived, it was not obvious that we were a threat to the people of Beirut. And so there was a sense that, things were getting better. Yeah, there had been a bombing at the embassy, not at the Marine Corps Barracks, but the embassy. But there was this back and forth, and I had gone up to the mountains with another dentist, and we had done humanitarian services to our missionaries up in the mountains in the Chute. We had gone downtown to see the American University of Beirut and talked to the dental school down there. So there was some activity, but it was in July where things began to change, and the bullets began to fly, and the potential for what ultimately happened changed on the ground, and things were not as fresh and easy as they were, I think, when we first got there.
Well, I led security patrols out there almost every other day. The lieutenants, we rotated going through, and sometimes you would go through parts of the Ville. We called it Hooterville, right outside of the the airport. And people were friendly, people would come out. But then you noticed as we got closer and closer into the July and early August, you didn't see anybody out. And you'd hear occasional rounds go off. I think there was one patrol that, not with the 8th Marines, but with the 6th Marines, someone had actually thrown a grenade at the patrol. So these patrols were dangerous. And the thing that I will say right now that really irks me to this day is we had a rules of engagement card that was so damn long. I mean, we could carry ammunition, but we couldn't have anything chambered in the weapon. If we got fired upon, we had to call back to the battalion headquarters to request permission to return fire. And rather than, if you got a sniper in the building, I'd put a 203 or grenade in there. No, you had to fire back to roughly the same caliber. Small arms, you had to return fire with small arms. It was ridiculous. And I don't mind telling you, it was very frustrating for me as a platoon commander because you had 18 or 19 guys on patrol, and if they got hit, I didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, how were we going to take care of these guys? And a lot of times on these patrols, you were out in Hooterville in Indian territory by yourself, and they could not have gotten to us quick enough if something had really gone down. And as the docs were saying, when we first got there, it was kind of neat because we had 4 hours at the line companies. I was in one of the infantry companies. So we had 4 hours of sun ops every day. Now sun ops could be working out with weights or just laying out in the suntan or doing whatever. And I think most of us like to lay out naked because the Mediterranean Airlines, the airport was right there, they would fly over and you would see people with their faces plastered. And I don't mind telling you, 2 or 3 of us kind of wiggled their bean at them as they kind of But after the 4 hours of sun ops, then we actually had to discuss operations because there was still a seriousness because as the sun went down, and this was even in May and June, the fighting up in the mountains was terrible. You'd see rockets, you'd see everything. I can remember sitting out one night just on some sandbags with a couple of buddies of mine, and it was a movie. We were watching the tank battle, and then we were watching artillery and rockets go back and forth, and we had no idea that eventually one day that was coming our way. So there was an ominous feeling that we all had when we sat there watching it.
Now, I don't want to ask about sunburns, but real quick, these are just some images of the building that would ultimately be the subject of the terrorist attack, and Don lived there. And I did.
Yeah, that's my room right there, by the way.
Which one?
The center room up very top.
Okay.
Because I was able to look at the Mediterranean Sea every day. Matter of fact, that was kind of like my thing. I would listen to like Pieces of a Dream. Name of the song was Warm Summer. I think it was something like that. Warm Summer. And we had beatboxes with the thing back in the 80s. And I would just play that one song every day, just look at the Mediterranean Sea because it was beautiful, and it was peaceful at the time. And we were young, and like Colonel was saying, we used to see the firefights at nighttime. So at nighttime, it was kind of like a show. We were young, dumb, and didn't know, and fearless.
Could you go back to that slide just one second? And again, from my perspective, I was in a fighting hole out at one of the line companies. That building right there, we were almost praying to ourselves that we would get to go into that building because we were the ones when the spillover fire, if you want to call it that, did take place, it was hitting us along the airport. It wasn't hitting the building. And so that was one of the safest places we thought at the time.
Yeah.
If somebody was sick, you get to go to the DOT headquarters. They got hot shower there, they got everything, they got showers. Everybody wanted to be in that building, and we never had any idea what was going to happen on the 23rd of October.
Yeah, and that building had been the aviation authority for the Lebanese, and the Israelis had occupied it, the PLO had occupied it. I mean, you guys were kind of sort of just one more sort of cycling through of a different force. And the building was built with a big atrium in the center just to kind of orient people around this. And this is a photograph of the inside looking down. If you've ever been to an embassy suites, you know how they're built so that they kind of, all the rooms kind of line a big open area. It was the exact same architecture. And so this is a shot kind of looking down from up above, and another one here that gives you a sense of what the inside of that was, the battalion landing team headquarters.
At the very top there, if the orientation is correctly, that was the medical, that's what the BAS was. We had 2 BASs. One was on the 4th floor, and then one was on in the basement. Is that correct?
I don't know
That
if I'm
your-
looking from the which left, right. I can't really tell. But I remember John's room would have been like that second or third one on the third floor.
You're talking about
Fourth
Dr.
floor,
Hudson.
we're on the fourth. Dr. Hudson?
Dr.
One,
Hudson.
two, three,
Yeah, he's on the fourth floor, yeah, fourth
Yeah.
floor.
I remember he had the room where he had inherited all the furniture from the guy that had been there before him. And so he had like a bed, a desk, and all that. But it also leaked from like a shell hole that had been in there at one point.
It was like
So,
a big hole in there.
yeah.
So,
So you guys, tell us a little bit more about the what it was like. This is a photo you guys out on patrol. Like what in the build up to that summer? Tell us a little bit about the activities and things that you guys were doing as part of the peacekeeping mission there.
Well, the Israelis were pretty active across into Hooterville, back and forth. And when we ran these patrols, we would often run into the Israelis. And we had a pretty good, friendly relationship with them. Except one night when I was at my platoon, one of the platoon sergeants came and woke me up and said, "Hey, sir, we got somebody cutting through the wire." I'm like, "Oh, hell no, we ain't going to have that." So we go running to see who it is. Well, it's some Israelis. And I'm like, and I won't use words here because the Corps prevents me from doing it, but I'm basically saying, "Hey, pal, what are you doing trying to cut through our position?" And he's like, "Well, we're trying to get easy access to go into Hooterville there." And I said, "Man, you speak pretty good English." He says, "Yeah." He said, "I just don't curse as much as you do." So I said, "Well, don't cut through my damn wire again." But when we went out in town, you see the children here. Sometimes they come out, we give them candy, we give them all kind of things. And that's how we were greeted that way in the very beginning. They were glad to see us. I mean, we were proud to be, "Hey, I'm on patrol. I'm leading patrol, security patrol as a 22-year-old Marine lieutenant." And everybody was very open and very kind to us in those first few weeks that we were there. And the patrols, they weren't that dangerous. Every now and then you'd meet somebody who threw a rock at you or whatever, but given those rules of engagement, we just had to take it and keep on going. You didn't detain anybody, you didn't stop anybody, you continued to move. And I can tell you that you knew there was danger there, you could almost sense it, you could almost taste it, but again, we were pretty lucky the first few weeks we were there.
The other thing was we were peacekeepers, and there was a British unit there was a French unit there was an Italian unit there, the United States Marine unit there, and we were all peacekeepers. We were separating the factions against the Israelis. The Israelis were there because they had been shelled, and the Israeli government decided to come up into Lebanon to try to identify and eliminate those problems. The same thing is happening today. But we were peacekeepers. We all knew we were peacekeepers, and we were trying to do a humanitarian service for the families, men and women of Lebanon. And Lebanon was a beautiful place. We could all see it. We could all see how pretty the Corniche was. It was just, but it was war torn, and the society there had been demolished since 1973 or 4, and they had civil war for 2 or 3 years during the mid-70s. And basically, there were religious challenges between the Muslims, the Druze, and the Christians, and they were trying to figure out how to establish a government that could take care of all of those people.
Big difference between West Beirut and East Beirut. Up in the mountains and up toward East Beirut, where the Christians lived, they were virtually untouched up there. And in fact, I was assigned as an advisor to a Lebanese battalion when I was up there to teach them indirect fire and working with 50 caliber machine guns. And so I lived up there with these guys in the mountains for probably about 4 or 5 weeks. And in fact, the battalion commander, Captain Wade, his daughter went to Clemson, and she was home for the summer. And she found out I went to South Carolina, and she was busting on me because I was a Gamecock and she was a Tiger. And I'm like, here I am thousands of miles away from South Carolina, and we're having football arguments right over here. But once you crossed into West Beirut, brother, you were in Indian territory then. Yeah. Anything went. Carr bombs, snipers, it didn't matter. You always had your guard up when you crossed the green line and went into West Beirut. That was where it was scary. And we did patrols to the embassy because one of the platoons that we had in Alpha Company had set up the security around the makeshift embassy after the American embassy was destroyed, and I think it was a building that belonged to the British. And so Pete Ferraro, who was the platoon commander there, had about 40 or 50 Marines, and we would drive once a week to the American embassy compound, deliver supplies and mail and everything else. But going through that town, I'm telling you right now, you had to have your guard up all the time.
I tell you, my experience wasn't as colorful as theirs because I was a medical asset. So, if you are familiar with the structure of Marines, they have Alpha Company, Bravo Company, Charlie Company, weapons, etc. So they have the line companies, and then you have the H&S Company, which basically handles all the admin, intel, and so forth. And I was with H&S Company along with Dr. Hudson. And but my buddies, because usually you have like 7 Marines to each company. 7 corpsmen to each company as a medical asset. So occasionally those corpsmen would come to the building and just kind of, just talk and tell them about their experiences. Like, man, we went out on a patrol today, man, we saw these great girls, man, and we got to eat some Lebanese food, and I'm just sitting there like, I'm eating like sea rats, and I don't get to see the things that they get to see, and they really, that's the thing about it, is that the Lebanese people were just stylish people. They called Lebanon the Switzerland of the Middle East. And, when they walked around, they were well-dressed in a war-torn country. And they all had the expensive French perfumes and colognes on in a war-torn country. And a lot of the Marines and a few of the sailors that were attached to the line companies got to interact with them. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if we're going to talk about it, but there was a corpsman who actually met an interpreter there and ended up marrying her, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So they had interactions, and all the while I'm sitting up there at H&S Company just wishing that I can go out there and see what they were seeing. So, but usually my first experience was, we had a large parking lot in front of us, and we cut the parking lot in half with Constantino wire. And every Sunday, the opposite side of the Constantino wire, the Lebanese used as a park, and they would just get together and just have fun and so forth. And of course, the Marines were on my side. And needless to say, the Lebanese women were gorgeous, and they was watching us lining the Constantino wire. So as you've seen in some of those photos, the Marines weren't big on having shirts. They would play football, and they would say, "Yo, Doc, throw the ball next to the Constantino wire so the women can see them," right? Shirtless, needless to say. And they would run into the Constantino wire and just get cut up left and right. And then they would come into the BAS and say, "Doc, can you pass me?" I'm like, "What are you doing?" So my experience was really with the Marines and the mischief that they tend to get into. There was another, I don't know if you're familiar, you remember that lieutenant? There's a lieutenant that some of the Marines used to sneak out, okay? There's a lieutenant that was in a Jeep, and the Jeep ran off the road or something to that effect. It was like early in the morning, and they sent me out to the site to administer aid. And I guess they probably went out to a club or something to that effect. And they got into a car accident on the way back. No one got killed or anything to that effect, but the lieutenant was in deep trouble. And he was just crying. And I guess his commanding officer or a senior officer came in, "Sir, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." And I was like, "Man, you're such a pussy." You got to go out in town and live it up, You knew you would get in trouble, but yeah, my experience was with the Marines and the mischief they tend to get into. So it wasn't as colorful as a lot of the guys who got to go out on patrol.
Well, let me say this. I went out on patrol into Hooterville. I didn't see one single good-looking woman holding it. I'm going to tell you right now, God Almighty knows. I mean, this was a rough-looking crowd. Now, to go with what Don said, when I went to East Beirut, and I was up in the mountains, and I went to the battalion commander's home to eat, yes, there's some gorgeous women there, but when you're walking a patrol, there's, in fact, that is my hooch right there.
That
tent right there is my hooch. because that tent got shelled. Luckily, we were not in it when it got shelled, but that's where we lived. Me, George Losey, and I want to say 2 radio operators in Portman lived in that hooch right there. You can tell that it looks like a mortar round came in there and probably took it out. So, but no, trust me. And my wife's sitting right here. No, ma'am. Up in the east side now, I thought about cutting the wide trail. I can tell you that now. But on West Beirut, negative Ghost Rider.
So in doing this, what surprised me was what happened between April and October, because I was obviously aware of the embassy bombing in April and the barracks and headquarters bombing in October. But what I wasn't so aware of, because it hadn't really been written about extensively in magazine articles or chapters in books or anything like that, was what happened between those 2 bombings. And I was wondering if you guys could tell me a little bit more about what happened from between the time you got there and how things started to shift. Like, did you sense a shift in town, and then we start to lose some Marines out there before the bombing in October? Was there an event that shifted, or was there some point where you said this is different than the previous month, or what was that like between when you got there and October?
Well, I mean, as I said, when we got there was firefighting was way up in the mountains, or the firefights were way in the mountains. But I think when the Israelis pulled out of the chute and pulled back across the southern border, then all the riffraff came down. And the only thing we had to us was our backs were to the sea. And so that's really where trouble began. As far as really feeling something was out of whack, we had a Sergeant Soifert who went to disarm a bomb or a shell, an EOD guy, and he was shot by a sniper. Yeah. And that was one of the first casualties, and I think that took place in June. And then July was pretty standard, but on the 27th of August, I took a lot of Alpha Company Marines and linked up with the French Foreign Legion, and we did like a kind of exchange. We did cross-firing weapons, we checked each other's uniforms and traded gear and back and forth, and we hung out the whole day. And then we came back to Alpha Company's position, and we cooked hot dogs that night for them and had a volleyball game or something with those guys. And they were pretty good guys. But we noticed again that the city was even more eerily quiet than it had ever been before. And then on the 29th, when I was wounded, that's when the Lebanese Air Assault Battalion landed on the airfield there, landed at the airport, and for whatever reason, they were conducting missions and going through our position up toward Hooterville and up toward the mountains. And all that did was draw that enemy fire onto us. And that goes into where, we had all our guys killed, or 2 guys killed on the first day, and that 14 wounded out of Alpha Company, 2 including me. And it just seemed that as the Israelis shifted south, it's almost like a wave of trouble started creeping up, coming down our way. And that was where the end was.
How about morale when you started to lose those Marines? What happened to morale? Was there a shift in the mission? Does the mission stay the same? But what happens with in that small unit that's going out with you?
Frustration.
It's very frustrating. I mean, Jim's talked about peacekeepers. We never liked that title. I mean, we're killers. We're trigger pullers. And I mean, the bottom line is, we were sent there to do a mission, and this is just Mark Singleton talking. We should have never had that mission. And I say that because I don't know what the strategic thinkers were thinking about at the executive level, but I mean, that's not where Marines need to go. You don't join the Marine Corps to hand out fruit and water and all that kind of stuff. We went there to kick ass and take names if that's what we want to do. And we start getting people killed. Let me tell you something. You punch me in the face, I'm going to punch you back. And that's how we all felt. We wanted to go get some. And hey, when are we going? Well, Sergeant Swartz killed. He's one of our guys. What are we going to do about it? And we just got to sit there and take it. And I can tell you there's nothing more frustrating than to be sitting in a bunker or to be sitting in a hole with mortars and rockets coming in, and you're just kind of sitting there wondering if it's going to come in the hole with you. And there's nothing you can do about it. That's the mission you got.
During this month of September, well, as the Colonel was saying, things were beginning to ramp up. And, we was getting more rocket fire, more small arms fire. And Alpha Company, where the Colonel was, who he was with, was getting more casualties than anyone else, deaths. And the first deaths came from Alpha Company, and the second deaths came from Alpha Company, and the third deaths came from Alpha Company. So, and you can just see that progression as time went by. And then we were all well aware, in the book they let you know, the Israelis were there to protect us because we were peacekeepers. And the Israelis, you know, when they left, there was like a feeling of gloom and doom amongst all of us because we were all saying, man, Israelis are gone now. You know, we're really going to catch it. Because we knew that just their presence was a deterrent, and it kept us safe. And then the month of September rolled around, and that's when, at the headquarters building, we started getting rockets for the first time. And then it was raining rockets for the entire month. I mean, it was so bad that we were using, you know, you have to go to your foxholes or your battle station to prepare for the worst. But we were there for so long, you know, we were defecating and urinating in buckets, and we couldn't empty them until there's a lull in the rocket fire. And needless to say, a couple of those buckets got knocked over. It wasn't a pretty thing. And but you just saw that it was just getting worse, and the morale was really plummeting at that point. Because what made it the worst, I guess what made it bad, was that we were just sick and tired of having to wait to, you know, we had to call Washington, D.C. and ask if we could fire back. And we was getting sick of that. And then the gunnies and stuff like that. We had one gunny, I can't remember his name, but he would say, "Be quiet down there." We're like, "Why are you being quiet? Can you hear the rockets coming in? You can catch it in your flak jacket?" You know, it was just, and I really don't blame the gentleman for being the way that he was, because we were put in an impossible situation. And we just was trying to negotiate the gravity of it. Really quickly, this picture right here, the guy on the right is Bob Holland, and that's Dr. Hudson right there. You can see his hair. His son has the same hair, by the way. He had like big hair. But this Dr. Hudson was a smart dude, and he was really a great doctor. We learned a lot from him.
He's a good man.
He was a good man, and he prepared us for this, because as things began to ramp up, he brought all the corpsmen in, and he would have in-service classes, you know, doing sutures or handling evulsions or you know, blast injuries and so forth. So he was teaching us and preparing us for the worst. And Dr. Hudson was another guy who was really keen on feeling out the environment. And he also, and I'm sure in the letters that he wrote to his wife, you know, you can hear the mood go down each letter that was written to her. And to the families, I did the same thing. I wrote to my mom one time, and I told her I didn't think I was going to make it. And I guess the ironic part of it was that everybody was saying the same thing when they were writing home. They didn't think they was going to make it. So.
Can I say something about Dr. Hudson? On the day I was wounded, which was the 29th, and the only reason I'm alive today is whatever it was, a rocket, a mortar round, artillery round, that landed in the trunk of an old cedar tree that was still there. And the shrapnel hit me in the face and in the leg and wounded my radio operator and the scout observer, and there was a Corporal Garchinsky who was a cook, and he wanted to get up and see the action, and he made some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches out of these damn military mess meals or whatever you call it, brought them up there, and he was handing out sandwiches when we all got wounded up there. And of course we heard George Losey and Sergeant Ortega, Staff Sergeant Ortega were killed. First two casualties, Alpha Company, and then we had about 12 wounded in I'm going to say the first platoon. Long story short is I stayed there all day long because I felt, as an officer, I don't get evacuated until all the lads get out first. So I waited till all the men got out, and a couple of times the Amtrak came, "Hey, get on." No, everybody's not out. Get everybody out. So I stayed there till probably about 1600 that afternoon, and Colonel Gerlach, the battalion commander, drove up in the Jeep. And he said, "Where's Singleton?" And I was like, "Over here, sir." "Hey, dumbass, I sent a track out here twice to pick you up. Why don't you go in. I said, sir, I'm all right. I'm not hurt that bad. I mean, I was bleeding a little bit. The doc had me patched up. So anyway, he took me in, and Doc Hudson came over to kind of look at me, kind of assess me. And that guy was a stud. I'm just going to tell you, everybody loved him. He said, and my initials are Mark A. They call me MA. MA, I'm going to have to take that leg off. And I'm like, what the hell? He said, gotcha. He said, you're flying out to the Iwo Jima to get operated on in the morning. I'm like, okay, thanks, Doc. And he's eating an apple. He just goes right on. He was a good man. And that's the way he was. There was humor in everything he did.
Yeah.
And everybody was scared. I was scared. I mean, that doom and gloom thing, you didn't know whether you were going to live or die over there because you had nowhere else to go. You had the ocean behind you, and you had all the evil people coming down out of the mountains. And just to have a guy like that, just to kind of solidify morale. And you try to do what we did, but just him just joking with me would take a lot of the stress off of it. It really meant a lot. And I want you to know that because he was a damn good man.
Yeah. He was the Hawkeye, if you ever seen that. He was the Hawkeye, hands down, hands down. He was brilliant at what he did. It was funny. He didn't care about the decorum and so forth. He's a trombone player, and he used to play it all the time. And he liked Dixie. It was a Dixie that he played a lot of.
Dick played a little bit of everything.
He played a little bit of everything. Yeah. From Georgia. He loved Georgia.
He didn't play a trombone around me. He just told me he's going to cut my leg off.
We could let's talk about the day of the bombing. Walk us through your personal experiences of what that was like.
Well, for me, I was about 250 yards away, 200 yards away in a separate building. And as we said earlier, this is October 23rd, 1983. But for the 6 weeks prior to this date, almost day in and day out, except for the week before the bombing, we had been shot at, mortar rounds. And so we had become acclimated. The month of September and a couple of weeks in October, we had become acclimated to the reality that every day was going to be a day of potential small arms fire, mortar rounds. For a few days before the bombing, things had quieted down. And this was a Sunday morning, early in the morning. And basically, we had our routines, but Sunday was somewhat of a day off. So most of our individuals were probably going to sleep in late. And it was early in the morning, 6:20. And I was knocked out of bed, riveted out of bed, 200 yards away by a very large blast, the loudest thing I'd ever heard. But from the standpoint of being acclimated, I just assumed we would get up and man our medical positions and move on because there was no smoke in my immediate area. There was no evidence that our building had been hit. And so I immediately established a medical facility in my building, which we did every day, to prepare for casualties. And for the next 5 or 10 minutes after this loud boom, we just waited down in the basement to see what had happened and began to have breakfast and made sure everybody was ready. The young gentleman over here, not young anymore, he was one of our ambulance drivers, and he was prepared in his corner. He's probably getting some peanut butter sandwich or something because we didn't know what had happened. And for the next 7 or 8 minutes, we just kind of hung low, just like we had for 6 weeks before on every day. And so that's the kind of the way that started, 6:20 in the morning. And the situation of these two gentlemen was a little bit different. So I'll stop there for that moment.
All right.
Well, by this time, I'd gone back to the artillery battery because I'd spent 18 months as a forward observer. And so I went back to be the assistant executive officer to try to move up the career path because I was going to be a career Marine no matter what if I lived through it. So we were about a half a mile away when it went off, and the executive officer, Dave Kelly, a guy from Massachusetts, he'll tell you he's from Massachusetts. He drove down in a Jeep just to see what had happened. I had been up all night checking posts to make sure these Marines were awake, and I had just come off duty about 5 a.m. So as soon as I basically had lain down on a cot, even a half a mile away, when that explosion went off, it blew me out of the rack. It turned the cots over. It shook the damn ground. And Dave Kelly went down and said, you ain't gonna believe this. He said, the BLT's gone. There's guys hanging in freaking trees in sleeping bags. And he said, Mark, you got to get in the tracks and go. So I grabbed those guys. I told them to get all their gear. I didn't know how long we were going to be there. I told them to grab a couple of MREs because we might be there for the next couple of days. And so we went down to the BLT. And I'm going to tell you to this day, that's a sight I can't get out of my mind because it was like you had a macabre Christmas tree with body parts and sleeping bags and gear hanging out of these trees. And as soon as we got there, you could hear people still crying in the building. Some people were already walking away from the building. And all we did is I had two sergeants, E5 sergeants. I said, hey, put a post down there at the end of that road. And I said, secure this site. The rest of you go in there and start pulling bodies out. And I said, if they don't stop for you, I don't care who it is, even if it's the ambulance, I said, shoot them in the friggin' head and stop them. I said, nobody else is getting into where this building is because the damage was just horrific. I'm telling you, I even talked to an FBI agent who had come over there about a week later. And he said, even if Sergeant Russell, who was at post number 1, had managed to shoot that guy 100 yards from the building, that the way that building was constructed, it might not have collapsed all the way, but it still would have collapsed because, as you saw in the pictures, it was hollow in the center. And when the explosion, the truck went inside, it blew the roof off, and everything came down on top of everybody else. And so that was what we spent the next 16 hours doing, is trying to save as many people as we could. And I had a buddy who was in that building, and I was really looking for him. And I know I probably saw him, but because you could, before we had DNA, like the doc was saying earlier, you recognize people basically by their tattoos or whatever. You know, that guy had this tattoo, or some guys had meat tags tattooed under their arms, so they had their last name and their social. And you identified people like that. And this buddy of mine who was a Citadel grad, Chuck Schnorr, who was class of 81, who I think there's a memorial here at Citadel for Chuck. What a great guy he was. He was a gymnast. And let me tell you, he was built like a brick outhouse, let's put it that way. And they carried a body out, and I just saw it from a distance, but I could not see because his head was just smashed. It was like a pumpkin, and I couldn't tell, but I thought that might have been him. I never saw him for sure, but I said, that might be Chuck. And I went back and I told him later that night, I said, I think I saw him pull Chuck out of the building. He said, are you sure? I said, no, I don't. And it was days later when we found out. But and the only other story I'll tell you about that is, and this is something that's kind of emotional for me, I went to the 40th anniversary last year for the first time, because I refused all these years to go to this damn Beirut memorial. This was something I wanted to kind of put out in the back of my mind. I wanted to forget it. And so I was standing at the memorial after the ceremony, and somebody says, Mark Singleton, M.A. Singleton. And I'm like, yeah, who's you, pal? And he's like, Lieutenant Singleton. I'm like, yeah. And he said, I'm Tim Valor. You pulled me out of the building. I'm like, what? And what had happened was that very morning when I was walking by, we were listening for screams and everybody else, and a piece of the building hit me in the helmet. And I'm like, damn, is the building going to collapse even more? And I looked, and there was an arm through this rubble. And I guess Tim had heard Marines walking underneath, and he grabbed what he could and threw it, and it hit me in the damn helmet. And I said, okay, we got to go out there, let's go pull this guy out. And we pulled Tim Valor out, and I didn't see him until 40 years later at the memorial. And we both cried and hugged one another, and I mean, I had no idea. I mean, I pulled so many people out that day, I don't remember. And I did not remember that specific case until he said, hey, I threw something and hit you in the helmet. I'm like, okay, now, yeah, I got it.
Yeah, that morning, I was laying in the bed because I was in the building. We had gone into Condition 1. Condition 1 was like the highest level of alert, and everyone had to scramble to their foxholes or what have you. We went down to the basement VAS, Battle Aid Station, because earlier on we realized it was really difficult to carry patients up 4 floors, so we decided to make the little battle dressing station on the basement so we can just carry them down 1 floor. Anyway, so I had a buddy of mine, earlier on there was a picture of a USO show. A band was out there, and they played the night before, or the day before. And another corpsman came up to me, his name James Jones. If you guys know James Jones from Savannah, I'm looking for him. anyhow, he came to the room, and I was like, what's up, man? He said, I was just reading my Bible. I said, Bet, let me say a prayer before I go to bed. So I said a prayer, and we went to condition 1, which means we had to go down to the battle dress, or to our battle station. And James Jones was, I found a cot. Now you have to understand, in Beirut, whenever we went to condition 1, you were there for hours upon hours. So if you had a real comfortable place, you would want to stay there. And we were used to this fire drill. They would call condition 1, then we'd go to our battle stations. Then they call condition 2, we'd go back up to our rooms. And then they would call condition 1 again, we'd go back down our battle station. This is all in one night. So I was like, man, I got me a cot. I'm not going anywhere, because they're going to be calling you back down here in a few minutes. I just know they will. And sure enough, they called condition 2, they went to their rooms, and then they called condition 1, and they were back, and these guys were like pissed off. They were like, man, because they were waking up in the middle of the night, and they were all grumbling and stuff like that, and I was just in my cot chilling. You know? And and that had happened twice that same night. Then the next morning, around 6 o'clock in the morning, I was still in the same cot, and it was on a Sunday, and Sunday was our only day off. So I had to use the bathroom, and it was Sunday. So I said, and it was a long way to go to the urinal, you know, and it was a Sunday, and I was like, man, I'm just gonna stay right here and hold it. And I must have dozed off to sleep again. And then all of a sudden, I heard this huge roar that must have lasted an eternity. It was just a roar, just kept going. And rocks started pelting my face, and I was in my underwear at the time, and I put my Unit 1, and Unit 1 was our medical bag that we used to carry around. I had my Unit 1 underneath my bag, underneath my cot, so I could grab it if I needed it. And then the bomb went off, and once the smoke had settled and everything else, and I had taken an injury to my eyes, both of my eyes at the time, and I'm blind in my right eye, and I was looking around the best I could to, orient myself. And I heard this Marine was talking, and people were getting to move around, and you have to understand the air was acrid. It was, fumes and heavy dust and stuff like that. It was hard to breathe. And I heard this Marine talking, and he was like, "Where am I?" I said, "Who are you?" I said, "You're in the basement." I said, "Well, where were you?" He said, "I was on the 4th deck." This guy had fallen 5 floors. And I saw a silhouette of him. He was just standing, talking, complaining, And but at that time, I was looking at him. It was just pitch black dark, but I saw a silhouette, and I was like, "Oh man," he said, "We got to get out of here. We're in the basement." And my face was bleeding, and so I took my T-shirt off to stop the bleeding, and I said a prayer. I said, "God, please get me out of here."
So at about the same time,
I got it. And I saw this beam of light come from the ceiling that was not there before. I'm here to tell you it wasn't there before. Because I looked around, I was trying to get the hell out of there. And I told everybody, go towards the light, go towards the light. And we started crawling out of the ceiling, pretty much. And at that point, I looked up at the building to see which side of the building we took around. Because I thought we just had around hit that side. And there was just nothing but clear blue sky. It was the most beautiful sky I'd ever seen. And then I looked down. And you have to understand, I'm in the basement. And I'm looking down. And I'm on top of a hill. And it was like a 30-foot crater. And with our training, we have to, and Dr. Hudson taught us that we have to do what's called triage. We had to choose which people we're going to save and those that we can't. If they're mortally injured, you have to leave them alone alive and let them die. So I remember this one Marine, he was laying down, because I wasn't knocked unconscious, and I wasn't dazed or anything to that effect. And the Marine was lying down, and his body was pristine. He had his skivvies on, he was a fit, young guy. Not a scratch on him, but his face was covered in rubble, heavily covered. And I looked over at him and I, triage. I said, I can't save this guy. And then I turned to assess and see if I can how I can get down from this mound that I was on. And then I heard rocks being thrown. And I'm like, who's throwing rocks? And at this time, rounds are cooking off. They were saying sniper fire was happening and so forth. And that same Marine that was lying down with his face covered in rubble was trying to save himself. And I lost it because I thought I made the wrong call. So anyway, there was another picture that they were showing, the Marine that was being carried. He's the guy that I pulled out. And if you could have saw him, that's me right there in my Purple Heart. And PX Kelly, yeah. So anyway, all this chaos is going on, and I hear this calm voice, help, help. And I looked down, and I saw this other Marine, and he had this huge slab of concrete over his chest. His head was the only thing that was peering out. And then I slid down to give him aid, but needless to say, as soon as the bomb went off, I started reaching underneath my cot to get my boots and to get my Unit 1. And I just couldn't get it. It was just full of rocks. I just couldn't get to it. So anyway, I slid down and I took the slab and I pushed him off of him. And it was Sergeant Yubera. Now, Sergeant Yubera was kind of like a medical groupie. He used to hang out in the BAS with us every day, long before we even went to Beirut. And he would say, Doc, I don't care what anybody said. You guys are all right by me. So anyway, I get down there and I said, Yubera, it's me, Doc Howe. He said, Doc. He says, what happened? I said, I don't know, man. We took a round. I really didn't know. And then when I threw the concrete off of him, he was literally tied up in rebar, heavily. And he had that huge rock in the back of his leg. I don't know if they can show that photo again, but you can see there's a huge gash in the back of his thigh. And at that point, the Marines from the blind company started coming in to help us out. And I told one Marine to give me his boot blouse so I could make a makeshift tourniquet to try to save his leg. And I said, man, you got a big rock in your leg. I got to get it out. He said, Doc, am I going to lose my leg? And the injury was horrible. And I lied. I said, nah, man, you'll be all right. Well, miraculously, he'd only lost his leg about 2 years ago, so he didn't keep his leg. But even then, he said to me, Doc, I don't care what anybody says. You're all right by me. So fast forward 25 years later, 25, 30 years later, I'm in Camp Lejeune, and I see Sergeant Yubera there. I said, Yubera. He said, Doc. And I sat with him with his family, and I said to him, Yubera, do you remember who pulled you out? He said, no. He says, I was on Good Morning America and so forth. They were always asking me, who saved me? I said, Yubera, it was me. He said, really? And I told him the whole story. And it was really moving because his whole family, he has a big family, was around this table. And they were just all captivated with the story when I was trying to explain to them what had happened. And his daughter was there. And she thanked me. She said, thank you for saving my dad, because I never would have known him. Because she was a baby at the time. And at that point, she was like 25 years old. So that was my experience that day. And needless to say, after I saved Yubera, the Red Cross started coming in, and I could barely see, and I just wanted to go home. And then I was thrown in one of the ambulances and taken to the Italian hospital first. I can't remember.
No, ended up.
I remember.
You came through
university.
You came up through my facility, and then you were at flight.
Okay, so I was an Italian peacekeeping.
No, it was MSSG.
Was it MSSG?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. And but this gentleman right here put me on the airplane that sent me to Frankfurt, Germany. So, but that was my experience that day.
Well, if I can add one thing, for every positive story, there's negative images from there, because I think of the ones I couldn't say. And I remember in one case there was a staff sergeant who was pinned between two pieces of rubble, who was talking to me just as plain and clear as I'm talking to you now. And I'm like, hey brother, you all right? Yeah man, get this off of me, get me out of here. And when we pulled the rubble off of him, his face turned completely white because he was pinched off at the waist. And we had no idea. And to see somebody like that die in front of you is something you'll never forget. And there were a lot of guys that we pulled out that we could not save. And the other thing is, the Lebanese were so used to the bombings and the killings because, again, the Lebanese Civil War began in 1975, and it had been going on. So they were used to war and everything else. We were not. There was a body that was being carried out, and I guess these guys just got tired and sat the body down and sat on the body and were drinking a Coke. And I walked over there and tried to talk to the guy, and he didn't listen. So I got his damn attention real quick and got him off. And realized real quick that it was just another day to them. I mean, even though we were Americans and we were trying to protect bodies and look out for people, death was kind of a sacred thing for us to protect and preserve. It was an everyday occurrence to them. They didn't think any more than that than sitting on a dead dog or whatever in the afternoon. And I'm telling you, we had Marines that were actually fighting because there was some looting going on. Some of the bodies that came out, there were people stealing stuff. And I told all my guys, hey, you know what to do. Collar a thief as quick as you can. And cigarette lighters and jewelry was being stolen, but we stopped all that while we were out there. And in addition to all that, it's always been written in the books that we were under sniper fire. And that's always been said in every book. And I just want to say one thing. I've been shot at a lot in my 3 combat tours that I had from Lebanon all the way to Afghanistan. And if that was sniper fire, that was a blind son of a bitch, because nobody got hit.
Jimmy, you are at the center of the medical rescue. So tell us.
I'd like to step back just a little bit. So there were 350 people plus or minus 15 or 20 in the building. So think of it as about 350 individuals inside that building on those 4 floors that morning. One of those groups was Dr. John Hudson and 21 corpsmen, 21 corpsmen. And that was the main medical establishment on the ground. But there was a second medical establishment, and that was in a building, which I mentioned earlier, where I was 250 yards away. There were 2 dentists in a group of about 12 corpsmen, 13 corpsmen in that building. And to go back a little bit, because here is a mass casualty with 350 individuals, some who were wounded, some who were killed. The United States Marine Corps, they deploy with their dentists, and they deploy with their docs, their physicians, and they deploy with their docs through their corpsmen. Early in the deployment, Dr. John Hudson and I and Dr. Bigelow, who's another dentist there, sat down and said, you know, this is getting heavy. And Dr. Hudson says, you know what, we need to be thinking about, you know, how we're going to divvy up casualties if we have a number of casualties. And you do 2 dentists, you don't really want to have to do this, but y'all are going to have to take the lead in your building, in your sector, think about how you're going to handle casualties. And he actually said, I'll take the first 5 and you take the next 5, because we're going to be overloaded. We're going to have helicopter capabilities on the northern side of the base and on the southern side of the base, but we may not have the ability to transport casualties between the 2 buildings at heavy arms fire. So for a good 2.5 months, we had been thinking in terms of how we would handle casualties. And during that time, between September, or August, I should say, and October 23rd, we had 58 casualties, 6 of those were KIAs or killed in action. Out of a group of about 1,000 people on the ground, that's not very good odds. That's like, what is that, 1 in 5 people? I mean, 1 in 20 people, 5%. So there was a lot going on, and we became acclimated in my medical group in thinking that we didn't want to have to take this responsibility, but we had to take this responsibility. And my guys needed to know what to do, and I needed to the best of my ability understand what the logistics were, what the communications were, and how we would take care of our Marines if they got injured and were on this side of the sector. So that's the background of how I became involved with the mass casualty situation that took place that morning. As I mentioned earlier, the first 5 or 10 minutes after the blast, I was unaware of what had taken place. But we had already taken casualties in the building before that over a period of time. We had direct mortar fire. So we were somewhat acclimated and ready for what we thought was to come. After about 10 minutes after the bombing, the blast, which we didn't know at the time could have been a rocket, my counterpart came back downstairs and said, "Jim, the BLT's been hit with casualties." So in my mind, I'm thinking we're going to have casualties. We'll take care of the next 5 wounded. Honestly, there was no explanation of what we were going to see, but there was going to be casualties. Within the first 10 to 12 minutes, we had the walking wounded. These were individuals who were covered from head to toe in white concrete dust. When they blinked their eyes, you could see their eyes, and that's all you could see: their hair, their face, their body. They were either naked or they had shorts on. Sergeant Matthews was one of the first people to come there. We were talking about him earlier, someone in the group. And he was totally deaf. And he totally gave the story to me as I sat there and looked at him to see what his issues might have been. He said, "All I know what's happened is I was on the top of the building and we heard an explosion and I was blown out and rolled down the side, rolling. Okay, well, and the corpsman proceeded to take care of him in my building. During the time when my counterpart told me we had casualties, he scooped up 6 or 7 of the corpsmen in my building and took them back over to that building. But quite honestly, still had no real idea of what had gone on. Over the next hour and a half, every 5 or 10 minutes, 6x trucks or Jeeps came rolling into the compound where the second, our BAS was, and delivered individuals who had multiple types of injuries. Individuals who were unconscious, individuals who had lacerations, individuals who had head trauma, and there were upwards of 50, 60, 70 individuals who we did not, at this time, have the capability to fly them to the ship, which is where basically we wanted to be taking our patients to. At the same time at the site, patients were being moved. Some of those patients went to Italian hospitals, as you described. But within the next 2.5 hours, the U.S. Marine helicopters were able to move 65 people from my site to the ship, and almost all those individuals survived. There was 2 that I know of who passed away. We had another 35 patients who we held because, in my mind, I'm still thinking Dr. John Hudson is taking care of more patients on his site. It wasn't until hours later that I learned that the building was totally down and that Dr. John Hudson, and 18 of our corpsmen had been killed. And we didn't know exactly how many of those had been killed, but all I knew is they were trapped in the building and they had not been identified as wounded at that time. So during the next 6-7 hours during that time, that was my experience, and I took care of those issues. Once I don't know who's going to speak about Lieutenant Wheeler, who's our chaplain. I mean, that kind of closes off the issue. But for the next 5 or 6 hours, the guys who came up out of the field, the corpsmen the Marines who were wounded but still wanted to take care of people, and the Lebanese soldiers who were nearby who came over to help us, and from the ships, some of the people came from the ships. We ransacked that building as fast and as best we could to try to find every human being in there that was still alive. And at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the last individual who was rescued from the building happened to be a chaplain, the Navy chaplain, Chaplain Wheeler. And his story is quite remarkable. I mean, they all are, but he was the last one to come out of the building and to be pulled out. And if you want to hear an interesting story, you'll go to the podcast that Jack and James did with Chaplain Wheeler, because he talked to God that day. And he made a deal with God, and he said he would understand God. And it's very, very powerful, because he tells about his experience being trapped in the building for 5 or 6 hours and how he was one of the last people to get out. Very, extremely powerful.
It's an incredibly powerful story. I'd encourage you, thank you for bringing that up, to check it out. You can find a link to it on Jack's website, and it's a very powerful one. I know Gabriel's about to have a heart attack over there because we've run long, and so we do want to have a moment or two for questions.
Hey, I'm Brian Simmons. I'm a school teacher, and I'm also a OIF veteran. I'm from Jacksonville, North Carolina. Nobody's really from there, but I was just wondering, what was like when you just got on Liberty in Jacksonville, when you were at Lejeune, did you experience kind of a culture shock? Because I know when I just went there, I sure did. And was Lejeune kind of like it is now, where there's like a lot of strip clubs and like tattoo parlors? Was it like that in the 80s? Because I was young in the 80s, so I don't remember, but I remember it from the 90s on.
I could feel that because y'all been hanging out. Camp Lejeune was a real sleepy town. The only thing that was going on was Court Street. And Court Street was pretty seedy. Now, I mean, you can barely recognize the place because it's really developed. And I think they kind of got rid of Court Street and kind of cleaned it up and so forth, But the Marines really enjoyed it. From what I understood, I didn't go to Court Street that much because I lived here in Charleston, so I would come home every weekend. But there was a couple of occasions I did go out there, and it has drastically changed since those years. Yeah.
If I can say, we do have a manual in the Marine Corps now. Why not marry a stripper? Mandatory reading for all PFCs and above.
All right.
Gabriel, you want to grab a next?
Just grab him right here.
Gentleman up front here. Oh, yeah. Oh, we got one back.
Hi, I'm Mark DeGarmo. I live up in Somerville, and I was a Navy corpsman from 83 through 89. Right out of Corps School, I'll say this real quick. They canceled all of our orders. Hey, you're going to Camp Lejeune for field FMS. I ended up stationed at the Naval Hospital, Camp Lejeune, and I was able to work with some of the survivors to hear their stories. It's just something I will never forget. And then several months later, probably a year later, I believe it was you, came from Cherry Point, and you gave a detailed account from your aspect. I believe so. And again, it's something I will never forget. And I'm so glad, first, for your service. Thank you for your sharing, and thank you for writing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Doc.
Hi, I'm Dennis Wolfley from Salt Lake City. After all is said and done, the bottom line to this is what? Did they hate Americans, or is it because we were friendly with Israel, or did any of the three-letter national groups give any reasoning behind this, or was it just a random attack?
This was an attack by Iran or their underlings, and that's been well proven.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Guys, thank you so much. We're going to wrap things up. Hand to these guys right here.